As a child, I had to have several ENT operations, and it was always that dreaded moment of going down to theatre to have the general anaesthetic that just caused this immense fear inside of me. And in that moment, I had a choice. Was I going to draw closer to Jesus and trust him? Going to allow the fear to get a foothold? Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't always get this right, but there were occasions when I did encounter that peace that only can come from Jesus. I had an old Walkman, one of those cassette players, and I took the cassette, put it in, put the headphones on, and whilst going down to theatre would be listening to music. And I just remember a chorus from one worship song which says, "Nothing will I fear, as long as you are near, you'll be with me even until the very end." And just having that worship music flowing over me in that moment gave me the peace. And ultimately I made that decision to trust in Jesus. And there are pivotal moments in all of our lives, aren't there? I mean, it can be ranging from an unexpected bill that arrives on the doorstep, or a worrying medical report that comes through from the hospital, or in the worst of worst case scenarios, when we lose a loved one. But this doesn't just apply, does it, to our own lives? This applies to the lives of those around us. We need to remember that this is part of our discipleship series. And when we talk about discipleship, it's not just about our own journey and what happens to us, but it's about us as disciple makers as well, how we are impacting and influencing those around and about us. And of course, all the things that I've mentioned apply to other people's lives, whether they're going through a bereavement, whether they need prayer for a crisis that's going on in their lives or their families' lives at the time. All of these opportunities, all of these pivotal moments aren't just life crises. They are pivotal moments when we get to have a discipleship opportunity with someone. There is a choice in each and every one of those moments to either draw closer to Jesus or to become more distant from him. And that applies to people who know him and don't know him. For those who know Jesus, it is obvious that we would want to cast our anxieties on him and draw closer to him. But even for those who don't know him, it's a wonderful opportunity actually to introduce Jesus to them, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the link between pastoral care and evangelism, sharing this good news that each and every one of us have. And this morning I thought it'd just be really good to look at this story that Claire's just read to us, and just to spend a few moments imagining, just putting ourselves in the scene and imagining what it would have been like to have been there. There's this story of this amazing woman. We don't even know her name. This woman who is described as having the issue of blood. And then another who we do know his name, Jairus. Now Jairus was a leader of the synagogue. He would have been a teacher of the law. And I'd probably imagine that he was teaching his congregation. He was teaching those he had influence and leadership over. Just be careful of this man from the north, this teacher from the north. After all, we know that the Gospels say that nothing good can come out of Nazareth. And here was this teacher from the north, from Nazareth. Some might have called him this snake oil salesman who was performing these tricks and claimed to have authority in his teaching. And yet I can imagine Jairus standing up before his congregation and saying any teacher worth his salts would be, he'd be teaching from the Mosaic law. And here is this guy coming and telling these provincial stories about men being forced to eat with pigs and widows turning their houses upside down looking for lost coins. Who is this guy? Stay away from him. Don't, let's stick to the Mosaic law. Don't get distracted by this man from the north. And yet, this same man, Jairus, has a daughter who is dying. And what does Jairus do in that moment? Jairus makes a decision to humble himself, to embarrass himself in front of his whole community. And he falls before Jesus' feet and he says, "Please come, heal my daughter." And then how does Jesus respond? Well, Jesus says, yeah, sure, let's go. And I can imagine one of his disciples, and you can read this in the earlier chapter in Luke, saying, oh, well, previously, a pagan centurion came and just said, Jesus, you only have to speak the word to my servant will be healed. And yet here is Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, humbling himself before Jesus, asking Jesus to come and to bring healing to his daughter. Now, if you visit the Middle East today, it's not an unusual sight to see men holding hands. And I can imagine that Jairus grabs Jesus by the hand and he's pushing through the crowds, running along saying, out the way, out the way. And Jesus is sort of being pulled along with Jairus. And they get to the road. They're almost there. They're almost at Jairus' house, this moment where Jesus is going to come and pray over Jairus' daughter. And then Jesus pulls his hand back from Jairus and says, wait, someone just touched me. I felt the power go from me. Jairus, just hang on a minute, just wait a minute. And Jesus turns and looks at the crowd that are all around him. And there's almost, Luke says, that they all denied it. Whoa, it wasn't me, I didn't touch you. And there's almost this Monty Python-esque moment where there's this comedy going on of it wasn't me. And Jesus says, no, someone touched me. I felt the power go from me. And in enters Peter. You can always count on Peter for a comical line in these moments. He's saying, well, take your pick, Lord. There's people all around you. Of course people are touching you. And Jesus says, no, it wasn't someone jostling me. I felt the power go from me. And then there's almost this moment where you can imagine, you get in a school where the teacher says, right, no one's leaving until someone owns up. And there's this moment where this woman is forced to come forward in the assembly of these men. And she says, Lord, it was me. I touched you. And at the moment that I touched you, this problem that I had dried up. I was healed in that moment. And Jesus says, my daughter, your faith has made you well. Now, this is one of those moments where it's worth hitting the pause button in the story to take what we know of it and what we know about the culture and the context and kind of mesh them together. We know that Dr. Luke, who's writing the Gospels, was also a medical doctor. And he tells us here in this story that this woman had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, at that time, in that culture, for a woman to menstruate was seen as unclean. We know menstruation is perfectly clean and perfectly natural today. But at that time, this woman, she would have been marginalized. She would have been outcast. She wouldn't have been allowed to go into the synagogue, into the temple. She would have probably not had a husband. Therefore, she would have had no one to provide for her. She was in a real mess here. I mean, it could even be said of her that she couldn't even turn to prostitution. And yet, so that means she was probably filthy. She probably stank. She probably was starving. And this feeble, trembling woman comes forward in this assembly of men and acknowledges, it was me that touched you. It was me that's been healed. And Jesus, for the sake of the community around and about her, calls her out and says, my daughter, it's your faith that has healed you. You heroic, faithful one. Now, if Jesus was only concerned about her healing, her physical healing, I'm sure at the moment he touched her, he would have carried on walking by. But he had a much bigger plan in mind. He wanted to reintegrate her back into the community. And therefore I can imagine him saying to those around, those assembled, men of God, you want to know what faithfulness looks like? Look here at this poor, trembling woman, filthy, outcast, my daughter, whose faith has made her well. Jesus lifts her up. He integrates her back into the community. Now, I don't know if you're beginning to see what's happening here. I mean, it's really clever what Luke has done by highlighting these two people that have these pivotal moments with Jesus at this exact same moment. On the one hand, you have Jairus, the sanctimonious, the self-righteous, who has to humble himself. He has to throw himself down before Jesus' feet. He has to become the humiliated one in order to encounter Christ. And then on the other hand, we have this woman who comes out of the shadows and is lifted up by Jesus, the humiliated one, becomes one with Christ. And in that moment, as they both come to Christ in their humanity, we see them as brother and sister. Astonishing. Now, of course, we could leave it there. That's amazing enough. But the story goes on, doesn't it? And it's so cool that we're going to keep going with our story. And as Jesus was getting closer to Jairus' house, as they would have been moving their way through the crowd, they would have begun to hear this sound. Now, again, this is a familiar sound even in the Middle East today, that when grief visits someone's home, when death visits someone's home, they gather, the ladies of the village particularly gather, and they just begin to wail and begin to cry. And it's almost like the sound of an ambulance siren going off. It's just that Jesus and Jairus, they would have heard it from a long way off, and Jairus would have held his head and he would have known that his daughter has died. And in that moment, one of Jairus' friends comes running forward and says, Jairus, don't waste the teacher's time anymore. Your daughter, she's died. You're making a fool of yourself, Jairus. Just stop. Just come home. And Jesus does something in that moment, which, I was never taught to do at Bible college. I certainly, as a hospital chaplain, wouldn't try this. But he just says, it's all right. She's probably just sleeping. It'll be fine. And all that Luke tells us, that everyone around Jesus just laughed and scoffed at him. Who is this man? What's he talking about? And in that moment, he gathers some of his disciples. He gets Jairus and his wife, and they go into the room where the body of this young girl lay. And in that moment, he comes alongside her and he says, arise, my daughter, from your slumber. Even in that moment, Jesus has the power over life and death itself. This foreshadows the resurrection, doesn't it? This foreshadows the power that Jesus has. In this amazing story that we've looked at together this morning, we see something of the character of King Jesus. We see the moment where he brings Jairus and he brings the woman of blood together, as I've said already, to be brother and to be sister. And we know, don't we, that Jesus died for us on the cross, but we also know that he's teaching us a new way of what it means to be human. Jesus satisfied the covenant. He was a substitute for Israel, but on that moment of his death and resurrection, he blew it all apart. The temple curtain was torn in two so that every single one of us can come into the presence of God himself. But this doesn't just apply to us. This applies to those who we're ministering to, who we're being made into disciples. We have the call and the challenge, don't we, to mirror the life and ministry of Jesus, to see the sanctimonious and the proud be humble before him, and the marginalized and the outcast lifted up before him, to love the loveless, to notice the unnoticed, to value the valueless, and to affirm the image of God in all people. So yes, we are called to affirm the image of God in people, but we are also called to speak truth to power, to pray for those in authority, and to refuse to allow our country to believe that the way out of all of our problems is through the election of officials and politicians and presidents. This is not where our hope lies, my friend. We are called as the Jesus people to say to Jairus, on your knees before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the one in whom we worship this morning, the one who is the same yesterday, today and forevermore, the one who broke the curtain that separated us from God, the one in whom we can come into his very presence this morning. And I invite you to do that now as we sing together this song, King of Kings, Majesty.